Good evening. We're discussing biblical literacy. In the individual stories of the Scripture in all 66 books, we find literacy mottos to follow in writing stories. The dialogue is richly intense and draws the reader into the plot, which a good story will always do. The stories that do not are those that allow the beginning to match the end with a simple reversal. None of the biblical stories do this. We have a beginning, middle, and end, and the ending of the stories is not a direct opposite of the beginning. Therefore, there is a complex plot, and that tends to engage the reader. The biblical narrative will contrast simple sentences and lower-level language with more vivid, complex language in stronger, more complicated sentence structures. We can find this throughout Scripture in every book and in every story. So you can see already in this just short moment that the biblical model of writing really holds up to high standards and will help students in any classroom. The stories engage the reader with plenty of imagery, poetry, and visualization in fantasy language. The fantasy language is mixed with realism throughout Scripture. So students would need to have an understanding of realism, which the Bible does have historical fact, but the students would need to understand that fantasy language is written throughout the Scripture. Even in the more literal portions, we still find imagery and fantasy, prophecy, allegory throughout all of Scripture. And students would need to understand this to have a representation of Scripture that does the Scripture justice. They would need to allow themselves to realize that you cannot take every single thing literally from the Scripture, although it is believed to be true by many people. This does not mean that we have to strip it of all of its allegory and imagery. That would be misrepresenting what the text is and what the author intended. The stories offer realism as well as fantasy in a difficult-to-accomplish mix throughout all of Scripture. Dynamic characters change from evil to good and vice versa, while their tales pull us into interest and emotional attachment by using close ties to our own experiences. The high interest level is there for readers who are not angered by the authoritative moral principle of the Scriptures, and for persons who will read the stories instead of assuming that the stories are dull, lifeless, moral myths. Meaning, if students young and old would simply read the Scripture, they would find the tales not only to be historically true, many artifacts have backed this up, but not only are they historically true, but they're fascinating stories. And there's a great model for writing in the biblical narrative. I would just like to add that the Bible uses imagery, metaphor, allegory, poetry, drama, and non-literal language, while at the same time, the text implies in its whole reading an authority that demands readers take sides for or against it. I think this is where the offense sometimes comes in, is the authoritative nature of Scripture is what can cause stumbling in classroom debate. But to work with that, we can use Bill Moyers in his Genesis, a living conversation models. He has 10 episodes that allow us to see professional debate. And it allows our students to realize that we don't need to argue about person's beliefs. All we would need to do is to respectfully listen to each other's understanding of Scripture and to be able to back up what we say, just like we would in writing. We need to back up what we're speaking about in a discussion with an example or two, or with some well-founded understandings of why we believe what we believe. And this can be done in amicable conversation, professional and thoughtful conversation, as modeled by Bill Moyers' Genesis, a living conversation. And I think that this would be definitely something I would use with middle and high school, upper middle school, and all of high school, and definitely with adults. I think it was eye-opening for me, having been in church my entire life, but only hearing the Christian view. I was not realizing how fascinating it can be to let us all struggle with the questions that the Scripture presents and let us try to work it out. And God lets us do that, and He gives us plenty of freedom to work it out. So we don't need to be offended by the fact that we have many different varieties of views. God allows it, so can we. So let biblical literacy be accomplished in the First Amendment rights. within our rights, we can present the Bible in any fashion we want, mixed with any Common Core standards, without it being a religious class, without it proselytizing at all. So I think we can prepare ourselves with further study to do that.